Welcome everybody, thanks for turning up. It's a bit later than last year, so things just went terribly against me on this volume. This is a very technical volume in that we're setting the tone for what the weather system was like in the area that night. There were 4 or 5 Aer Lingus planes, all got into trouble. 2 of them got into deadly trouble. One almost crashed more than once, and we know the St. Kevin came to grief. The other plane was a plane called the St. Coleman, which the call sign was Charlie Taylor. And they got out of there by the skin of their teeth. In fact, one of them spoke to pilots of the era and said that multiple times they thought they were dead, but thankfully they got out of there. They had a lot of luck. They came down on the sky at least once. And what I mean by that is they literally stalled out of the sky. But they came down somewhere in the valleys. Now they were in pitch black darkness with no radar. They didn't even have a radio altimeter on board. It was the luck of the draw. They ran into a plethora of terrible conditions, including severe icing, which the DC-3 was particularly prone to. And they also lost all their electrics on board. They could not communicate with the ground stations, and the ground stations couldn't even send out a signal to them because there was a lot of static in the atmosphere from the thunderstorm. It was a complete confluence of different weather phenomena that all almost conspired against the flights that evening. In fact, one of the flights before these 2 flights got through by the skin of their teeth. They missed the icing. The ice was descending at 70 feet per minute. Captain Cuhan ran right into the heart of it all. He got no heads up to also go against him. It was a whole sequence of events. It's like it's often referred to as the Swiss cheesecake model or something, when all the holes line up and everything lines up and death is for you. This happened in the case of Foxlove, as we call it in the airline business, which is the St. Kevin. The call sign was Foxlove. So when they'd be on the radio to ATC, it would strictly be Foxlove Inn or Foxlove whatever. A man that was working the Preston Weather Centre in very close to Norwales, that was his area. He knew, he was handed a sheet at 5:15. That's 11 minutes before the St. Kevin even departed London, that the icing was descending much more rapidly than thought. And they knew it was going to go down to 2,000 feet. Bear in mind the mountains in Snowdonia are 15 peaks at 3,000 feet. So they were flying in very, very dangerous territory with a brilliantly robust aircraft, but very, very unsophisticated for what they were about to fly into. This controller literally said that it was not his job to pass on this information to the pilots, which it, strictly speaking, was not. In any event, someone else did squeal, for want of a better word, and leaked word back on the telephone down to Uxbridge. Someone in Uxbridge had the gumption to start warning pilots that the weather conditions had deteriorated dramatically. Unfortunately, the only person that never got the warning was Captain Cuhan. And what happened next is obviously self-evident. Now, we will never know what happened on the St. Kevin, but we know with absolute precision, down to as fine as you want to get it, we know precisely how things unfolded on the sister ship that was trading with St. Kevin. And when they got in, they finally got out of there, and again, they had the look of the draw because they were flying blind in dense cloud in pitch black darkness with nothing working on board. They had a very basic compass, but they could not home the radio compass couldn't home in on any of the beacons. There was also Aer Lingus were deliberately flying this route, and they were the only airline flying this route to save time, money, and hourage on the airplanes themselves. And they were branching off at Daventry and going a direct run to Nathan, which is off the Welsh coast. It saved about 15 minutes off the flight. The whole idea was that the flights were faster, they were more efficient, etc., etc. But in that 150-mile sector, they were effectively in no man's land, where, generally speaking, what they should have done was gone up to Liverpool and stayed with beacons every 30 miles apart, and then cut across to Bangor out on the Welsh coast, and then straight to Dublin. In any event, we know what happened. St. Kevin came to grief. But separate from all of that, I had an amazing phone call this day last week. I'll repeat what some of you heard in Wales. On April 15th gone by, I found something spectacular which changed everything with the whole story. Now, I had already suspected that there was a cover-up, but it wasn't what I found, it was what I did not find. Where they said somebody was, it just didn't pan out. And from there I went digging and digging and digging, and this day last week I had a phone call from an absolutely most amazing man. I had known of him for 8 years. He was a colleague of Christy McCran from town here, and he worked on the crash site. He phoned me literally about 5:30 this day last week, and he asked me my name, and I said I am, and I said, God, you must be nearly 100 years of age, and he just wryly responded, I'm retired, And he set the tone from there on for our conversation. And we had a 28-minute conversation. And everything I asked him, it was 2 words reply: I did, I will, I was. I said, look, did you find a piece of the aircraft miles from where it should have been? And he said, I did. And I said, did you report it? I did. And I'm going to be choosy with my words here, because he is the crux to the whole case, this guy. But he had already reported this, and it is on record elsewhere. In fact, it was published in a book, a private published book more than this in the 1980s, and went nowhere. But where he found a piece of that aircraft, a piece of the St. Kevin, it effectively solves the riddle as to where we're going to take the story. That was this day last week. It was beautiful to find it right at the end as we're bringing the story to fruition. In terms of the passengers in this edition, this lady here, Bernie, her uncle Dan, Dr. Daniel O'Donovan from West Cork, was killed in the crash. And he has never ever been spoken about or connected to it. His story is dramatic in that, I'm sure I'm allowed to say this because it's in the book anyway, in that 2 or 3 hours after he died, he appeared on the farm in a spectral format. And that's all detailed in the story. And that was witnessed by a lot of the children at the time and the parents. Of course, the biggest hook in the story is this guy in the cover here. He's an atomic scientist working in Los Alamos. And he was traveling with a plethora of documents on his personal belongings, including 2 different passports, one in his father's name, which was issued days before he traveled. It's not for me to say what he was doing, but we can certainly say what he was not doing. He was not skiing in France, as was given in a report by the US government in his demise. But Aer Lingus completely denied that he was on board, and it's not that they were big-brained enough to do that. They were told what and what not to say. While a flurry of calls went between the American embassy in London and obviously out to Washington, D.C. And 30 hours after the crash, Aer Lingus acknowledged he was on board, but they only gave his name, no address, and they listed him as an engineer. Now, I don't know if any of you have ever watched documentaries on the Manhattan Project, but they were all down as engineers. They were not even allowed to be a physicist or a mathematician. Bill Lynch was actually a chemist. And his brother, he was 21 and his brother was 20 at the time of the war. And his brother worked directly with Oppenheimer on the atom bombing. By the time he was killed in the crash, he was working on explosive triggers for the hydrogen bomb, the super bomb that Truman signed off on. And we follow his entire life through. His best friend was an amateur photographer, professional photographer shared the name Bill de Alva. And Bill de Alva was camera mad, and he photographed everywhere they went, and he annotated everything on the back of the photos. And from those photos, we can actually follow this guy's entire career, even though it was supposed to be super secretive. We can put him in several different states, and we put him in different countries along the way: Britain, Ireland, France. And you bear in mind, he never got to Ireland. But the 2 countries he did get to were both allies of the United States, and they were both atomic weapons aspirant at that time. The only confusing here is that in 1946 the Americans brought in the McMahon Act, which basically forbade them from sharing atomic secrets with any allies. But America was backwards to the wall, given that China and Russia were rapidly developing their own atomic energy and bombs. It's up to the reader to decide what he was doing, but when you read what was on his possession, the sheer amount of foreign currencies, passports, inoculation, this guy had absolutely everything, and yet nothing with addresses on it. But all we can do is surmise that in the middle of the night, when whoever was collecting the body belongings found all this stuff on this guy, something went amiss. His girlfriend is still alive in Los Alamos at 97. I go to her every January, and her and her husband, her current husband, obviously she married actually before he was killed because they broke up. But he said to me only this January, he said to me, there's no way that the CIA wouldn't have tore that mountaintop apart. And I said, Americans can be, it's all about America. And I said, but we're not talking America, it's Britain. Well, he said, who God hell or whoever, the CIA would have had that mountain tore apart. Well, it turns out that the military and the fire brigade and the police were all over the mountain that night, obviously, from 9:40 p.m. Hello, Miriam Mora. It turns out that the next morning at 6 a.m. a special army unit was mobilised from well down the coast, and I'm sure Daniel can help me pronounce it, Tonafau, T-O-N-A-F-A-U camp, military camp, Tonafau, down the coast. And very bizarrely, the British Home Secretary, who was the right-hand man to Churchill, etc., was on the mountaintop the next morning with his permanent undersecretary. It's all detailed there. None of this is my opinion, they're simple facts, but I cannot say, I don't have an opinion to give. We just present the facts and let the reader decide as to why people of such eminence went to the mountain the next day. But I have to say that, and I wish he was here, but he's in France right now. Michael Cuhan in the bookshop, who's a nephew of the captain, who's still playing in the bog to this day. Michael Cuhan said to me when I started going into him 25 years ago that a ring of steel was put around that mountain the next morning, and to be quite frank with you, I put it down to a bit of a hand-me-down old wives' tale. But it turns out that he was 100% correct on it. So if Michael were here, I would say sorry to him. So it's just been a fabulous journey getting to Volume 2. Volume 2 is quite technical, by the way. It's technical from two aspects. It's technical in the following of the story of the aircraft that was trading to St. Kevin, because we have to be as accurate as possible when we're going to take this with the evidence, because we will never know what happened to St. Kevin. We will have an abundance of circumstantial evidence. And it was very technical in dealing with Bill Lynch. He was quite complicated, and the things he was up to and what he worked at were quite terse to try to get to the bottom. But it's all out there. So there's a letter in here which we reproduced. His father was born in Mung, County Leitrim, which is 5 or 6 houses, population 20-25 people. It was at the bottom of Shamrock Hill, and his father's father was evicted off that land with a family of 10 or 11 in 1887. So the father of these two atomic bomb makers, he left with his family at 3 or 4 years of age with bare soles on his shoes. They all went out and they worked hard in America and prospered. But this particular strand of the Lynches, they had this particular strand of genius, for want of a better word. And these two boys excelled dramatically in school. So much so that the US military were running a program at that time, I can't think what the name was, but they were going around and they were scouting for the creme de la creme of brains of America. And the eldest boy who's on the cover here, he acquiesced and he joined. The younger fellow said, no way. And they just conscripted him. They had literally said to him, easy way or the harder. He said, I'm not going. So he was conscripted. And he was sent to military boot camp in California. It's all here, and a picture of him here in his military uniform. So one got to wear the suit, the other got to wear the fatigues. But eventually, their mother was reassured that they would both be suited, both be in suits, and they would be answerable to the top tier out in Los Alamos. Thankfully, I did get to meet a man called Mel Brooks, who was directly answerable to Oppenheimer. He's known as the man in Los Alamos, and I actually was in his house and met him, even though I was told by everyone he'll never see him. I talked my way into his house, and when I asked him what was Bill Lynch doing in Europe, because there's a hierarchy here. You have Bill Lynch and these guys, then you have the team leader at Popolino, then you have the divisional commander, which is the Mel Brooks I got to see, and he was answerable initially to Oppenheimer and then to Edward Norris Berry, who took over. Edward Norris Bradbury, who took over after Oppenheimer, immediately after the war. When I asked Mel Brooks point blank, what was Bill Lynch doing in Europe? He smiled at me and he said, I don't know, and even if I knew, I'd never tell you. And that in itself was worth its weight in gold, because it speaks volumes. But on the 10th of December, 1 month before the crash, Bill Lynch's father posted Bill Lynch a letter. Bill Lynch is now in Los Alamos, working on the hydrogen bomb. His father sends him a letter. We know the letter because the family turned it over to me, but we do not know what Bill Lynch asked his father in the letter, in his letter to him. But the response is a full page here, you can read it, and he details why are you asking me if we've got a clean sheet? The FBI have never, we're this, we're that, we're squeaky clean, we're this, we're that. You know, you can rest assured whatever the FBI boys are putting you through, your family is squeaky clean. In fact, he says your poppy never got his nappy off set. In any event, 3 days after that letter arrives, Bill Lynch gets a false passport put into his father's name. And if you go and you watch some of the Los Alamos documentaries at the time of the bomb, that was common practice. And the reason they would get a passport in your father's name, so if you were overseas and you were asked what you worked at, you know the old adage, if you tell a lie, you have to tell 2 to the other first, 4 to the other second. Well, it was a standard lie. You said what your father worked at, which you're never going to forget, because in the time of your father's era, there was no atomic program. So on all of the documents you will see here, Bill Lynch signs off as a rail dispatcher. His father was a rail dispatcher. His father never had a passport in his life. And this passport was issued 3 days after the letter arrives back. To answer the question of what was he doing coming to Ireland, in the guise of the letter that we don't know the content of, but in the response from his father says, I don't know why you want to go looking up where I'm from at this point. No, he said, excuse me, he says, I can't believe what I'm about ready to check on. Now he's 70. Your pop cannot believe when he's getting ready to check out, well, you want to go back to the old sod. And then he tells him, get to Dublin, get to Carrick and Shannon, and he explains about the length of the biggest river in Ireland. And he said, ask someone to direct you out to Mung, get to Mung and knock on doors. And the Lynches there are our people. Now, had Bill Lynch done that back in 1952, people would have remembered. When I had to do it in 2012, I was met with it. Nobody knew what I was talking about. For instance, and the book is dedicated to this lady, my favourite person, don't take offence to St. Kevinites, but my favourite person of all the St. Kevin families is a lady at the bottom of Shamrock Hill called Maura Goldick. Sadly, she died 3 weeks ago. But her daughter, myself and herself used to go through a packet of Mikado biscuits at least once a month. We'd carve them down the centre and we'd drink tea. But the first time I ever went to her, can you imagine calling to a woman in her 90s and explaining to her, you have a cousin who was killed trying to get here to you in Aer Lingus' first plane crash. His body is still over there, the plane is still in the bog. He worked on the atom bomb, at the hydrogen bomb, at the time he was killed, and him and his brother both worked on the atom bomb. His brother played a critical role with Oppenheimer on the atom bomb. And this woman, you met her, she had a fantastic sense of humour. And Mary Burns, I do believe you met her. Yeah. She had a fantastic sense of humour, and she says to me, and you expect me to believe that, boy, she said. I said, no, I don't. But I said, when I'm finished with you, you will. And it took me 4 years going back and forward and getting data and birth certs and going all the way back as far as we could and stringing it together. And one day she just said to me, stop, I believe you, I absolutely believe you. But what gave me great inspiration the first time I met her, I said to her, I have no scientific theory to base this on. But what I do have is I have all his brothers and sisters' names. I said, his sister was Eileen. Well, she said, my sister was Eileen, my aunt was Eileen. I said, his brother was William. Oh my God, she said, my father. And all the names resonated, all these first names. But eventually we narrowed it down, and that lady is actually, not only is the book dedicated to her, she's pictured in it showing the entire history of the family. Ironically, had Bill Lynch got to Mung and knocked on her door, and sorry, before I say that, ironically, even though the Lynches were evicted out of that home, number 1 Mung, her grandfather got it, because he did a deal with the landlady, and he got it in turn. So this Maura was born and raised in that house. This Maura, she became Goldrick in married life. But ironically, had Bill Lynch got to that door, she wasn't there. She was out in America herself, recovering from TB. Her uncle was a big bishop out in New Jersey at the time. But the sequence of events are so ironic. Her father got sick when she was in America, January 1952. That's important you remember that date. And the post office girl rings her, and there was only a post office. The Leitrim village had a rotary phone, and they call her in New Jersey and they say, your father's not well, get home. And she's there, okay. And then the father grabs the phone, he shouts in, don't fly, we've just had a big plane crash, sail. And how deeply ironic that her cousin who was coming to see them was killed in that plane crash, and she did not know that for 62 years. In fact, nobody, not one person, I would go as far as to say, not just in Leitrim, the entire country of Ireland, knew about this until we uncovered it. But his work is why we're a month late here this time. An average chapter takes 4 to 5 weeks. This took 5.5 months, and it was round-the-clock work. And you're meeting a lot of people who don't want to give you answers, including his contemporaries, several of whom are still alive. And your uncle is in it, and the air hostess is in this one. The co-pilot is in it. His was the only body found intact. And a lovely little 15-year-old girl called Lee Wenman is in this story. Very similar age to my mother, and she was killed coming to live with her grandparents because she didn't get on with her stepmother. Her life was a litany of tragedy from the moment she was born, from getting scalded and having to wear high tops where she destroyed herself with porridge. And they just had a terrible, you know, if you want to think, if you ever get a thing going, I had a hard life, read Lily Wenman's. Lily Wenman had a horrendous life, and her life was snuffed out at 15. And Lily Wenman is still in the plane in the bog. We're 100% certain of that because her father was a real tough guy who did 4 years in a POW camp. I'm not saying that because he was military. He went up the mountain and he met a certain police officer and he told him in no uncertain terms, he said, we're doing this 1 of 2 ways. He said, I'm going through, but you're going to try and stop me. And he said, and even at that he said, I'm digging the hand with a shovel and I'm doing it with my hands when I get in my daughter. And he spent hours going around in big ever-widening circles, crying his eyes out, and he got nothing of his daughter. So a very, very sad tale, and that is the story of Lily Wenman. that's about it for this edition, guys. Yes, of course.
Yeah, but just when you're talking there, you're talking about Lynch and hydrogen bombs. Around this time, there was also the flying enterprise of Captain Carson, and the question of what he was transporting and why such lengths were gone to try and get him ashore.
Well, I never. Can you believe it? He's extensively featured in Volume 1, and that never went into my head.
Maybe that's the line to pursue.
Yeah, he was hauling gold for sure.
He was more, yeah, but why was your man over there in the UK at the same time?
Well, Michael Cuhan, I wish he was here to listen to this, because I do not believe Michael, like anyone telling stories, there's hand-me-downs and they get skewed, they get legs and wings along the way. Michael Cuhan told me there was rumoured to be gold on board. I visited a man only last Sunday, Daniel, who knew your grandfather. I sent you this in a text. I visited this man who's had a big stroke, but he was in the best of humour. His father was the policeman who headed up the whole mountain that night, John Williams, and he was told to ring the site because there was gold on board. There was no gold on board the St. Kevin. There was industrial diamonds on it. There was standard what could be on a plane going to jewellers in Dublin to be ground into rings and what have you. But there was no rhyme or reason to the extent of what they did to close the mountain. And bear in mind, we know today it will be closed completely, but back then things were a lot looser. In fact, all of the locals will tell you that they went to the mountaintop. They were getting there right up to the middle of the night, and then when this army contingent came in, that was it. They were non gratis. And just think about the fact that a British Home Secretary, one of the biggest wigs in the government, one of Churchill's right-hand men, Sir David Maxwell Fyfe, who was the main hanger, for want of a better word, the main prosecutor at the Nuremberg trials of the Nazis. He hung loads of them. He went up that mountain the next morning. I think that leaves a lot of questions to be answered as to who and what the value of Bill Lynch was, or what was the significance of the crash site. Because it didn't have a significance for the first 12 hours. It had regular significance, which was to retrieve what you could. Anyway, Gordon, I never thought of that question before. Never. What was on the Flying Enterprise? Yeah. Because he stayed with that right. That's in Volume 1, the ship that sank, and they stayed with it right till the very end. Anybody else?
You forgot about the winds when you were talking about the flight over the mountain.
Yes.
There was a horrendous headwind that night too.
Yes, there was a
the ground speed of the plane was way down.
Yeah, Jerry will appreciate this. There was a huge. The headwind was so ferocious that the forward speed of the plane was literally less than half of what the thrust of what the engines would normally propel it at. And they were literally, and that's why I'm entitled to use the word gale force. I was very careful using those terms. Gale force is anything over, I do believe, 90 mph. They were encountering 94 miles an hour on the nose, and their forward speed was only in the region of 160. So they were well down under halfway. Plus the fact that it's a horrendous bumpy ride. Plus the fact that they're burning an alarming amount of fuel for the overground traversing that they're enjoying. So.
And then there's the mountain wave where you get that lee wave.
The lee wave, that's all in it. Yeah, we even have diagrams of it. Yeah. They were getting the mechanical turbulence. The St. Coleman behind the St. Kevin. But basically, in this volume, we come up with what are called 7 phenomenal weather complexes to what we call the perfect storm. It is originally 7 when this term was formed in 1936 in Texas by the American Weather Bureau. But we customize it and we make our own. Well, we by and large use the 7, but we customize them. The what ifs in the worst case scenario, planes transiting the Welsh mountains that night could hit. And we know for absolute certainty that the plane behind the St. Kevin, the St. Coleman, ran into all 7 of them, in a prolonged sense. And how they got out of there is just absolutely, it's a miracle. They had looked on their side multiple times. And the wife of one of those pilots is still alive. And she's told me her husband just told her it was out of this world flight. They just literally kept losing control of it. Sorry.
Oh, just for connectivity, the St. Coleman was only 35-40 minutes behind the St. Kevin.
Yes.
So it's not like the storm would have changed
dramatically
or anything. It was the same storm.
Yeah.
The St. Coleman had a heads up that it was heading in.
The St. Coleman got ahead. Yeah, the flight in front of the St. Kevin, which I believe is the St. Patrick, they got ahead. Everyone got a heads up except Jimmy. And this came up in the inquiry. And it became known as a grave lacuna of information, a gap in the information, in the informative process. And even when the air traffic controller Richard Parker was asked, how in God's name could you have done this? He said it wasn't my job. And it turns out the traffic coordinators in Preston, they were deliberately asked not to pass on pertinent weather because it was afraid by the airlines that they would overread into it and they would become weather forecasters or weather real-time casters, and flights would change. It would have a dramatic effect. So the litany that they had to go through, if weather changed dramatically, which it did, Richard Parker had to go back to his boss. Well, guess what? The other guy was out due to staff shortages. There's only one on board one in the centre that night. So he couldn't leave his desk, but he would have to go back to his boss. His boss would have to get permission of his boss in Uxbridge. They would have to write up a report. That report would have to be submitted to Aer Lingus. Aer Lingus in Dublin, someone in management would have to look at it. By that time, the plane has crashed. It became, this all in fairness, a lot of things did not come out in the inquiry, but this particular insanity did come out. That this madness, that there was no protocol, was so outdated, it was impossible. But as I said earlier, one of the controllers, and we do know his name was T.E. Coppinger, he actually did squeak, and he put his name to it. He said, I'm telling you that you're going into hellscape. That wasn't his word, that's my word, but he basically gave the flight behind him a heads up. So when they got into it, they knew it was the mother of all battles, and that is the plane. They literally stole out of the sky. That story has never, the story of the St. Coleman's never been told. And when they gave their evidence at the inquiry, they walked a very fine line between not wanting to hang their comrade who's dead on a mountaintop, or not wanting to hang the company they worked for, and they were very coy with their answers. But one particular barrister who was representing the Radio Officers Union, he pretty much nailed them, and he had a well-versed chip to nurse. Or he was nursing a well-versed chip on behalf of the Radio Officers Union. All the radio officers had been dispensed of 16 months prior. And the pilots, the vast majority told the line, there was a group called Teach's Disciples, and the son of one of them is here tonight. And they sort of were not entirely for this. They argued against it. It transpired that when you put this entire combination together, Aer Lingus should never have been flying that particular segment of that entire route at that time of the year in horrendous weather. Because if a confluence of all those things came together, the outcome was likely that they were going to lose a plane. Before you ask what about other airlines, British European Airways, if they flew that route, which they did not, but if they did, they only went with a modified, same plane as the St. Coleman, the St. Kevin, but it was a modified, what was called a Pioneer, and they had instant access to a thing to give them a reading, a G-fix. The pilots on these planes could not, the violence was so, I mean, you cannot describe how violent the turbo was. They couldn't leave their seats to be smashed against the ceiling. In fact, the plane that almost crashed was shook literally to pieces, and how they came down alive. But thankfully, it got out, and the captain of it, it's all detailed here, he actually did a very unusual thing. He came to the top of the row of seats and he apologised to them all when they were out of danger, and he said, we're stopping here tonight, I'm sorry for what you went through, it won't happen again. I'm sure there was people on that flight that never flew again, and I'm hoping that some one or two will come forward, because this is the kind of information nobody will give me. And if someone gives it to you, they give it in an anonymous sense. And you know, I've had phone calls with living pilots from Aer Lingus in the 90s, and they will say they'll talk to me, but they will never meet me, because if they meet me, they're afraid of litigation in case I have a camera. Whereas if they talk to me on the phone, the first thing they'll say on the phone is, and I've had this done to me, I do not give Gavin Walsh permission to take this call, which of course means the call is invalid in any testimony. And then they'll tell you, they'll let it off their shoulder, their chest to you. No more than this guy last week who found a massive piece of the plane 2 miles away in a different direction. That says it all. Anyway, anybody else?
What would you have done with that piece?
I'm not going to answer that. I have a reason for that answer. Sure.
You know, when we were talking back home about coming here tonight, and I just said, you're hoping down to this, that you're going very far away. And when I explained, and when I said the first Aer Lingus
Air crash.
everybody
Thinks it's Shamrock.
They did.
Yeah.
And nobody had heard.
Yeah.
These would be people older than me now.
Yes.
And I just wondered, nobody had heard. Why is that?
It was
Never documented.
no, this crash has never been documented. That's for absolute certain. It suited the powers that be. Aer Lingus was 40% owned by the British government, and 60% owned by the Irish government. And they had just been declared, and this is a full chapter, they'd been declared the safest airline in the world 14 months to the day, the 10th of November 1950. And I think consequently from that, there was a massive embarrassment, and It was batten down the hatches and protect the airline's reputation at all costs. Plus there was huge litigation. If the airline could have been found at fault, the doors would have been open for a flood of claims. As it did happen, people did sue Aer Lingus. The maximum you got, if you had 4 children and they were very young, the maximum you got was £3,000. If you sued them and you couldn't prove that you were dependent, which did happen with sisters and brothers, they fought you in court and you got 50 quid. A one-off payment of 50 quid. Different times, it would never happen today, but it happened. And such is life. That's not what I'm really, and I appreciate your question, and I do answer all that in each volume. In fact, I detail how much they put a classic stroke on your uncle's widow. They let her go into court and make a claim, and then they held up the race car to the judge and said, she just inherited his estate, and his estate is equal or greater than to, and then they invoked a subsection of the 1936 Warsaw Act, combined with the 1929 Irish Fatal Accidents Act, and your auntie got 0, nothing. And the judge realised he'd been blindsided. These guys were so smart. Your first cousin got 1,525. It's all detailed. This is court documented. It's evidentiary stuff. So just different times. It would never happen today. It would not be allowed to happen today. And the same question has been asked to me by several people, and I'm not going to answer it. It is a fact that there is an Aer Lingus plane in a mountain top in Wales with people with body parts in it. It is 100% fact that Captain Cuhan is at the front of that plane and has been left there. With suitcases, wings, engines. When the plane hit the bog at 85 degrees, I don't have the exact speed for you, but I'll have a close enough speed by volume, hopefully by the next volume, because we know the height it came down from. When the wingtips, the first thing to hit was the fuselage went in like a dart. The wingtips, with their centrifugal force, continued and were found hundreds and hundreds and hundreds of feet in every direction. The wings with the engines attached slapped back. This all happened in a nanosecond. They slapped back against the fuselage and, like a dart, powered down into the ground. And Christy McCran from town here, and Charlie Harris and Charlie Staffs and a few other big names, Ken McCoy, they went down on ropes. They went down literally into water, and they were thrown up suitcases, body parts, and eventually the man in charge of it all, Flying Officer Brooks, who was a doctor as well, medic, he called it off for safety reasons. But to this day, if you walk across, and I only had this discussion last Saturday up on the mountaintop, if you walk up there in the dark of night, and you walk in there, you will not come out alive, no matter how good of a swimmer you are. You'll be gone in seconds. It is jet black, and there's nothing around. It's in the middle of nowhere. And we have put poles 9 and 10 feet, as long as we've doubled up walking sticks, and they've just gone in straight into water. And that detour was created by the St. Kevin, where the St. Kevin lies to this very day.